Hello and welcome to Cherry Red TV. My name is Ian McNay and today we're actually talking to Ian Glasper, who is one of the authors for Cherry Red Books, our book publishing company. Welcome Ian, hello.
Thank you very much.
Ian has actually written already 2 books for us, The Day the Country Died and Burning Britain, both set in the 80 to 84 punk period. And you're writing a 3rd book at the moment, aren't you?
I am, yes, yeah.
Which is about the hardcore scene from 85 to 89.
Yeah, the late 80s punk period.
Yeah.
So I'm keeping myself busy.
You are indeed. So what's your motivation for doing this, Ian? A lot of hard work, isn't it?
Yeah, it's definitely a labour of love. I mean, it's something I think needed doing more than anything else. I was writing articles and reviews for Record Collector, and I think I got sent three books on the Clash in a month, and 2 books on the Pistols. And it dawned on me, you know, when is someone going to write a book about Discharge or the Exploited, you know, or GBH? I mean, these were the bands that to me were UK punk bands, and they seemed to be getting, you know, overlooked, and the media were basically giving us a whole, you know, a false spin really on what the UK punk scene was. Just concentrating on the you know, the more spectacular bands of the, you know, late 70s.
So they want basically the big bands, the dramatic stories, and the breakups, the drugs, and all the rest of it. Yeah, you know,
Sid Vicious, Dead, you know, and whatnot. And I thought it was a much more interesting and real story that a lot more people could relate to in you know, the early 80s punk scene. You know, disaffected youth, you know, in sort of suburban and rural areas, picking up that whole punk ethic from the late 70s, and, you know, and running with it and taking it somewhere different.
So for people that are maybe younger and don't know what the punk ethic is, how would you define that?
Well, it's a bit tricky. It's like trying to define, you know, God. But I mean, essentially, I think punk was a very liberating musical genre, which lent itself to many different interpretations. So, you know, people could take from it exactly what they wanted to take from it, what they needed to take from it, in actual fact. So if you just needed to get down the front and pogo and spit on the band and, you know, let off some energy, let off some steam, you could do that. Or you could be guided in your lifestyle, you know, lifestyle choices by, you know, punk. It lent itself, you know, to all sorts of decisions and interpretations, you know, theological, ideological. So, I mean, I wouldn't like to try and define punk, but I can define it for myself.
It's like a spirit, by the way.
Yeah, absolutely.
Seems what you're talking about, individual spirits.
Yeah, yeah. It was much more than, you know, just a musical statement, if you wanted it to be. I mean, some people didn't want it to be anything more than, you know, a good record. But from a very early, you know, from a very early age, I was touched by punk in a way that to me was quite profound, you know, and it did change my life. You know, it's an old cliche really that music can change someone's life, but, you know, with punk it really did. You know, my life has been different since I first heard, well, Discharge.
That was the first band you became aware of that was a punk band, Discharge?
Well, in hindsight, it wasn't, because I was aware of the Sex Pistols and Susie and the Banshees and, you know, and stuff I was seeing on Top of the Pops. But, you know, it was more like a peripheral awareness. And when I heard Discharge, it sort of kicked me, you know, straight between the eyes. You know, it was so unlike anything I'd heard before. I mean, I was listening to, like, I loved Killing Joke, I loved, you know, early Adam and the Ants. And, you know, these were like forerunners, I suppose, or, well, forerunners, afterrunners, whichever, you know, whatever your perception is of it. So I was listening to some punk music, but to me, punk, you know, was defined by Discharge.
So the kind of often called the first wave of punk, which started around, I think it was that famous the summer of '76, and there was the 100 Club weekend. It's quite famous now, when the first gig think it was the first gig of Susie the Banshees, and Sid Vicious had his own band there, and I think the Clash played Damn, 999, etc. And that, looking back on it, compared to the bands you're talking about, Discharge, etc., that was quite melodic, the first wave.
Yeah. Well, I think everyone's like perception of something is defined by their entry into it. And like in 1976, I was 9, so I really had no grasp of what was happening at the 100 Club that weekend. But come 1980, when I was like 13 years old, and it's a very, a very fertile age, obviously, for absorbing influences, and my hormones were going crazy, and whatever. That to me was when it struck me that this was something that was for me. Like you said, by then we were well into the second or third waves of punk, but that was my first wave.
It was your introduction.
Yeah, and everything else that I discovered from there was in hindsight, and none of it quite matched the intensity of like Discharge.
And was it the lyrics as well as the music that pulled you in?
I don't know really. It's I think with Discharge, it's more like it's something it's almost like a primal level that I felt Discharge on. Lyrically it was fairly primitive. Musically it was even more so. I mean, the production left a lot to be desired, but none of that really mattered in that, just the emotions that it stirred. Everything else, all the other music I was listening to at the time suddenly paled into some sort of, insignificance really compared to Discharge.
Yeah.
And then, unfortunately, when I went back to rediscover bands like the Stranglers and the Damned, who were all great musically, fantastic bands, but none of them quite, could capture that intensity of Discharge.
Because they became quite poppy, the Stranglers, and also the Damned to an extent.
Yeah. It's interesting that as I became a musician quite quickly after getting into punk, and as I got better as a musician, I appreciated those earlier bands more and more. So I probably love the Stranglers and the Damned more now than I ever did when I was younger. So I think Discharge was so important because they took the 3 chords that the Ramones had made famous or whatnot, and they just delivered it with a whole new aggression, which was just so perfect for the time, really.
So you mentioned you were in a band. What kind of band were you in to start with?
Well, I was in a punk band.
Of course,
Yeah. And we were called Ammonia 77, and we started actually I was in a band before that, which was the same band but with a different name, and we were called Pubic Lice. But we, quickly outgrew that name for obvious reasons. And Ammonia 77, I've got no idea why we chose that name. I think we were trying to, just sort of doff our hats a little bit to the 77 punk thing. But that's over-analysing it, I think. I think we probably opened the dictionary and saw ammonia and thought, right, Ammonia 77. We did like 12 gigs, all local. Every one of them ended in some sort of bun fight, with trouble and stuff like that, which was again another trait of the punk scene at the time.
This was around 1980, was it?
No, it was 1982, the first gig.
Yeah.
So I think it took me, 18 months to grasp the rudimentary, to tune the guitar and, etc. And it was my cousin Anthony Mowbray who taught me to play bass. It was the same guy that got me into Discharge basically and punk. So, he's got a lot to answer for really. And from there we did another band called Decadence Within, and this is where we started to develop, lyrical themes. As well as Chaos UK and stuff. I was listening more to Crass and Rudimentary Peni, and there was some deeper things going on lyrically by then.
The more anarcho side of it.
Yeah. We wanted to reflect that with a more intelligent band name, that hinted at some of the feelings we were trying to convey with our music. And in Decadence went for a long time. We did 4 albums and toured Europe a lot, and I think we did 300 shows or something.
So it was a full-time thing for you?
No,
for a time?
no, it was part-time.
Right,
I mean,
okay.
when I left school, I was unemployed for a year or two, as like most people were, and then it was full-time. But we couldn't support ourselves playing that, that sort of music that badly.
But 300 gigs is quite impressive.
Yeah, we did about 300 shows over like maybe eight or 9 years.
Yeah.
And then I went straight into another band and just kept gigging.
So at what point did you start writing?
I think probably in about 1984 or 85, I started doing a fanzine. It was called Little Things, Please Little Minds. And it was a Xeroxed, totally homegrown DIY fanzine. And this was the beauty of punk for me. It was like, it was so empowering of everybody as an individual. Bands like Crass, they actually told you how to do these things for yourself, so you realise you could be a band. You could get up on stage and play your own music, write your own
empowering,
lyrics.
wasn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. So,
yeah.
You could release your own records. If you had something to say and you couldn't, get it published, just publish it yourself, So that was the beauty of it for me. So ever so quickly, we were putting on our own gigs, trading tapes, writing fanzines, and basically doing what I've done, in the new books, interviewing bands, so sort of, honing my literary, chops, as it were. But I was writing at school. I did A levels at college in history and English language, actually. So,
but it's a big step to go from writing for a fanzine to actually writing a book, which is 400 pages, 250,000 words, or whatever.
Yeah. I mean, it's ever so daunting putting that first word down.
Just this is a weighty tone here.
Yeah.
Must have taken you because you obviously have a full-time job.
Yes,
must have taken you a long time to do.
I think probably 2 hours a night for about 2 years.
Right. Yeah.
With the occasional evening off to talk to my wife or, watch a film or something like that. But yeah, no, it was like I said, it was a labour of love. But once I got started, I was determined to finish it.
So what was the game plan? Did you have it clear in your mind what it was before you started, or did it evolve a little bit as you got going into it?
It did evolve. I think there were a few key moments when I was deciding to write the book. Like I said, I got sent all these Clash books and thought, someone really needs to write a book about Discharge, about my punk scene, because that's how everybody views it, isn't it? That I wanted to write the book that I wanted to see on my own shelf.
You wanted to read, in effect.
That's right.
I understand that completely.
So I got kind of fed up of all this Clash and the Damned and everybody saying that the UK punk scene was over by 1979 and whatnot. And then a guy called Stephen Blush published a book called American Hardcore. And I could see similarities of what he was trying to do with what I wanted to do. He went through the country region by region, covering a whole host of really obscure bands, and you could just tell, the love he had for this music. And I thought, that's what I should do, but about the UK punk scene. But from a fanzine, I started writing, contributing to some magazines, Terrorizer, Record Collector, and so I got more and more used to seeing stuff I was writing in print, because it's a little bit odd the first time you see something you've written, actually published. So, my confidence grew, and eventually I thought, right, I'm going to take the plunge. And I drew up a chapter plan and, some rough ideas, and it did change drastically as I sort of
You've done it
up.
regionally, the book, haven't you? You've taken various areas and then done the bands that came from those areas.
Yeah. I mean, some people might regard that as a bit of a cop-out, really, rather than writing a an overview and pulling all these threads together into a cohesive whole. But I actually wrote the books almost like a jigsaw, really. So I didn't start at chapter 1.
Yeah.
I started with whichever band I could get hold of. I wrote their chapter, and then pulled it all together, and then rewrote it once I had all the parts. Because obviously, I'm referring to stuff at the end of the book for the first time when I wrote it. But when you read the book as it is now, it was maybe the 50th time. So it needed several reworks.
Yes.
To bring it all together.
Did you find everybody was cooperative to start with?
Yeah, actually they were. I mean, there was very few bands who didn't want to appear. I mean, obviously most of them were just pleased that, someone cared enough about...
Remembers them, yeah.
Yeah, like that 1 7-inch that they did in like 1984 or whatever, So a lot of people were really, really pleased to hear from me. A lot of people were very uncertain on my motives writing the book. I think people have been burnt in the past by journalists, and so they were wary of being like misquoted. I think they thought the book was maybe going to be something sensationalist, trying to dig up dirt, on bands. But once they realised that my motives were very pure, everybody jumped on board really.
And was the people that wanted to be in the book you didn't want to include?
No, not really. There were people that I wanted to be in the book that I couldn't include couldn't get hold of them in time, basically.
Okay.
But there was no one that approached me and said, "Oh, I really want to be in there." But I was like, "No, thanks." I mean, I had to draw a line at some point. A lot of people ask why there isn't more oi bands and skinhead bands in the book, and really, I just didn't feel as if I was qualified to comment on that scene. So rather than, pretend to be knowledgeable about something that I wasn't, I just concentrated on, the bands I felt confident
It wasn't
about.
something you were drawn to at the time?
No.
Yeah.
Although I do touch on bands that, the more skinhead and oi bands that lent more towards the punk scene, bands like The Business and the Foreskins and Blitz, they were embraced by punks as well.
Yeah.
But, there's no bands in there like The Last Resort and stuff like that, not because... I didn't dig what they were doing musically, but, I just didn't like them as much as, just wasn't as clued up about what they were doing.
So it's personal in a way, the
Absolutely,
book. No, which
yeah,
is great,
yeah.
yeah.
I think...
it reads like a story, a lot of it, I was flicking through it again last night, and it's just, you start to read about an area, and there's the interconnection between the bands and everything.
Yeah, that's right. I did try to let the bands tell their own story, rather than me put words in their mouth. And a lot of people seem to like that, rather than me lecturing people about, I don't know, about how tough it was to grow up in Newcastle upon Tyne in 1981, because I've got no idea.
Yeah.
I let the bands tell their own story. So, I mean, it's very quote heavy, and, some people like that, and some people don't. I mean, I could have acted more like an interpreter and filtered all that information. But I think it's more colourful coming from the mouths of the bands, really.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
And that's why someone asked me once if I would do a signing of the book, and I said I would only do a signing if they could get all 87 bands to come and sign the book with me as well, which sort of scotched that idea and stopped it in its tracks.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. So you finished this book, Burning Britain, the first one here. And then you were even more brave and went for the second one, The Day the Country Died, because you knew what it involved workload-wise.
Yeah, well, I paused for breath, and I mean, the two books were going to be one volume.
Anarcho-punk scene, this one.
Absolutely, yeah.
So to start with, you just said they're going to be one volume.
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
It was going to be my take on early 80s punk rock, and then when I realised there was going to be like 200 bands, 1,000 pages, going to cost 30 quid.
1,000 pages is a big book, yeah.
No punks can afford it anyway. It's just like, what's the point? So I thought I'd break it down. And there was a sort of natural divide between the bands of Burning Britain, which are more like the Studs and Leather punk bands. I use that, term purely for convenience, really. But bands like GBH and The Exploited, spiky hair and, you know, slightly less serious lyrics than the bands like Crass. And then the Anarcho book is much more those bands like Crass and Flux of Pink Indians, Conflict, with a very serious political agenda when they picked up their instruments. You know, whereas the bands in the first book were, you know, they, not to say they weren't political, but I think they had different motivations for making punk music, really.
Yeah, I always felt, having watched, you know, bands at the time, I always felt the kind of, the first book, the Burning Britain book, it's more the bands that have got the anger and the passion. And lyrically, the lyrics are angry, a lot of them, want to destroy, and yet it comes from their heart, yet they haven't thought things through necessarily. It's not an alternative, it's just expression of where they are and how they feel. And yet the anarcho-punk scene was more thought through. It was like, oh, well, there's maybe an alternative way to live. And there's an alternative way to do things.
That's right.
And the lyrics express that. So it's more practical in a way.
Yeah, it's like when I first got into punk and started listening to The Exploited, I don't know, and they're singing songs like I Believe in Anarchy, but they're not developing that idea any further for you. So they leave it completely open to interpretation. So, like, you know, 13 years old, living in a really boring rural town, you know, we broke all the windows in the local youth club, so we're not allowed in there. So we broke all the windows in the bus shelter, so we're not allowed in. We can't sit in there, you know. So it's like, well, you know, let's start a band and get out of town, really.
Yeah.
But you know, that I think that was the difference. It was like channeling that youthful rebellion into something that was intelligent, really, and articulate. So you've got all this sort of anger flailing around, you know, and you're vandalising stuff, and then all of a sudden you're doing a fanzine and trying to put into words, you know, your mistrust of the system and all these institutions that, you know, you've grown up with and stuff like that. You know, it was a step in the right direction anyway for me. You know.
See, it must be interesting having, especially with the anarcho scene, having met and certainly talked, even met a lot of these people now, and seeing how they're living now.
Yeah, it was.
Had this political ideology over 20 years ago, and I'm wondering what you found there.
Well, you know, I don't want to explode any myths or anything, but
well, it's in the book anyway.
Yeah, that's right. So go and buy the book. But no, there's a lot of the people are still living exactly how you would imagine them to be, and other people have grown up and got jobs as policemen, you know, so they flirted with it for a while.
But they're probably great policemen.
Hopefully, yeah.
Yeah, because if they were a narco side, they understand the frustration and the directionless that they had at that time. And here they are, a policeman. One would hope they understand why people are doing the same thing now.
I mean, that's you would hope that it had coloured their, you know, their judgment and stuff. I mean, I do find that everybody that used to be a punk, even if they're not now, has carried with them this sense of questioning everything that you're fed, spoon-fed by the media, etc. So, I mean, you know, people I know that have grown up with punk seem to they watch a news report on like the war in Iraq, and they read something totally different into that to what someone who's blindly accepting what they're being told by the media. And I find that with like most of the ex-punks I know, even if they're not into the music, they still have this questioning, you know, this questioning going on in their head, this awareness that everything might not be quite able.
It's a challenge to the status quo, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right.
And it's quite encouraging to know it's still there.
That's right, yeah. So I mean, it's quite good to see people I know who were in anarcho-punk bands are now teachers and, you know, and things like that. You know, it gives me, you know, it's quite an optimistic, you know, thought to have.
Yeah.
So, having said that, you know, some people definitely did fall from grace, as it were. You know, so.
We'll let them remain anonymous. It's okay.
Yeah. Let's be diplomatic about it. But I mean, there were people that didn't want to talk to me for the first book, well, and the second book, because it would compromise where they are now. You know, I wanted to talk to one guy about, you know, ferociously anti-system single that they brought out, you know, in the early 80s, but he's a lawyer now, and I don't think it would do him much, you know, do his current career any good if, you know, if it got out some of the lyrics he'd been writing back then, you know, and stuff like that. So, you know, all you can do is respect their privacy and acknowledge that, you know, everybody moves on and some people take different paths in life, you know, and try and find someone else who was in that band to dish the dirt on him.
I actually know lawyers that used to be punks. They weren't necessarily in bands, but they were punks, and they're good guys, you know. Yeah. It's all part of life's experience.
Yeah, he felt uncomfortable with some of the questions I asked him, and he said, you know, he just didn't want to, you know, participate.
Yeah, let's talk about the third book, which you're working, you're beavering away. You're 2 hours a night now.
Yeah, yeah.
And this is about the UK hardcore scene from around 85 to around 89.
That's right. Yeah. So
which kind of bands are you including there?
Napalm Death are probably the one band that most people will know because they were on TV and stuff like that. But Extreme Noise Terror, Heresy, Ripcord, Concrete Socks, The Depraved. Basically, what we called the UK hardcore scene was when the two scenes that I've covered in the first two books, the anarcho-punk scene and the sort of studs and leather punk scene, you know, they just merged with a whole host of other influences. American hardcore was coming across via tape trading and magazines like Maximum Rock and Roll. I mean, people were consuming these, you know, like they were the Bible, really. I mean, it was interesting, it was brand new. You know, bands like, I don't know, Bad Brains and stuff like that were so much more musically adept than some of the UK bands. So it was really exciting time. And there was a big punk metal crossover going on, bands like Agnostic Front and Cro-Mags in America, English Dogs and Onslaught and Sacrilege over here in the UK. And they were merging punk with metal in a very exciting way. Whereas bands like Discharge, when Discharge eventually went off the boil and brought in heavy metal influences, I mean, they completely fumbled the ball with their, you know, their Grave New World album. I mean, it was horrendous. It's like all the worst elements of heavy metal and all the worst elements of punk. Whereas the crossover bands of like the mid-80s, they took the best elements from each scene and made something, you know, really, really quite sort of visceral and exciting. So it all came together, and this UK hardcore scene sort of emerged.
It seemed to get musically more extreme, didn't it?
It did get musically more extreme. I think with each wave of punk, you know, as it sort of influenced the next one, everybody wanted to turn it up a notch. Yeah. And I mean, Discharge were already pretty extreme. I mean, I couldn't imagine hearing anything faster than Discharge.
Well, I remember going to see bands like Disorder and Chaos UK. They were pretty extreme. Then I saw Extreme Noise Terror. Yeah. And they hadn't managed to up the ante.
That's it, yeah, that's it. And, you know, then Napalm Death pretty much took it to its logical conclusion. But, I mean, people are still pushing the envelope now. I mean, I'm still into a lot of, you know, extreme music, and there's a lot of death metal bands that are still pushing, you know, pushing the envelope of how fast you can play cohesively, you know. But I think Napalm Death were a watershed moment in music, and I think Extreme Noise Terror were as well, in that they did something vocally with the two vocalists who basically sounded like, you know, well, like grizzly bears, like, you know, gargling, diesel fuel. No, that's right. You know, and it was exciting. It was exciting. You felt like you were on the cutting edge of something, you know, when you went to see bands like that. You know, I don't think we thought, oh, history's in the making now, but it was really, you know.
Is there anybody that you're looking for a new book you're trying to track down that we could maybe mention now and they can get in touch?
Well, I've just got in touch with Atavistic at last. They were a band that I was really starting to despair of getting hold of, but the guys from Concrete Socks, you know, I really need to get hold of some of the guys from Concrete Socks because they were an important, influential band.
So if they're watching this, if they
or
contact me at Cherry Red, I'll pass it on to you.
Yeah,
The
that would be
information.
fantastic. Yeah, that would be really good. I mean, there are other bands I really want to get hold of, like Life Cycle and Bad Beach, and basically if anyone played in a UK hardcore band between 85 and 89 and I haven't been in touch with them,
they better email me.
Yeah, as soon as they can.
Yeah, okay, good. All right, so and when do you hope to complete the new book, Ian?
Well, I'm running behind schedule. I mean, I've set,
Yeah.
but that's
That's
sort of
normal,
my prerogative as an author. It's not something that you can rush really, and it's quite an organic thing the way it comes together. Every band that you contact, they talk to you about another band, and you think, oh, I've left them off the list. So it grows and
That's
grows.
the exciting thing about it, isn't it? Yeah. The more you get into it, the more you realise there is to cover.
That's it. Yeah. So, I think, and it's nice as well to discover new music from that period when you think that you had everything, and then you realise you didn't. So I wouldn't profess to be an expert, but I'm trying my best. I mean, I bought every single record I could afford to buy as it came out, right the way through the 80s. But there were still records I missed.
You must have a big record collection.
Well, yeah. I mean, therein lies the story. I mean, I sold all my vinyl to start my own record label back in the late 90s.
Right.
And the reason being, I thought, well, if I get run over by a bus, my wife will probably sell them all in a car boot sale for like 50p each. And, no one, so let's get rid of them now to people who want them at a price, that I can reasonably fetch for them, and put the money back into, propagating underground music, really. Yeah. So I did sort of, 20, 25 CDs on a label I did in the late 90s. I instantly regretted selling my records, but gradually got it all back on, CD.
Okay.
Thanks to the sterling work of people like Mark Brennan and stuff,
Captain Eye Records.
Yeah,
that's right,
put all the singles and all the albums on one disc.
Yeah,
it's great.
Yeah. Okay, Ian, I'm going to thank you for coming in today.
No problem. Thank you for asking me in.
And just to remind you, the two books that Ian has out, both on Cherry Red Books, Burning Britain and The Day the Country Died. And there's also DVDs of with the same names, covering the same bands, which are available. And we should also hopefully have a DVD of the
I mean, the DVDs are just a useful extension of the book, really.
Yeah. Okay, thank you for watching Cherry Red TV, and we'll see you again soon.
Thanks very much.